G'day, I'm Martin Isles, and this is The Truth of It, ACL's weekly newscast on politics and current events, where we cut through the fake news and bring you what it says on the tin, which is the truth of it. And today, first item, of course, the latest on Israel Folau. On Friday just last, on June the 28th, negotiations with Rugby Australia broke down at the Fair Work Commission between Rugby Australia and Israel Folau, and now the matter looks set to go to the federal court, with all reports suggesting that that's what Israel Folau's legal team believe is the best course of action. Now, Folau has many critics in the media, and I had to face them last week, and after more than a dozen TV interviews, similar number of radio interviews, and who knows how many interviews for print media, I think I've probably been able to isolate the key criticisms, and I'm going to run through them and give an answer to Folau's critics. Firstly, I was constantly asked, should people really be allowed to discriminate? Shouldn't that come with obvious consequences? Well, okay, let's talk about discrimination. The reality is, if we want to look at what Folau actually did, he spoke. That's what he did. It was speech. It was expression. He spoke. Compare what happened to Israel Folau. Well, firstly, he was fired from his job. Secondly, he was banned for life. And then the other football code that he's able to play, they came out and said he wasn't welcome there either. And then his father was attacked in the media, then his church, there was a brief targeting of them for a moment. His GoFundMe page was taken down, and then his wife was dragged into the media and attacked as well. Lies, by the way, were able to persist about Israel and the terms of his contract and the things he had said and done for some time, and we had to clear those up. And then, of course, the latest is that ACL hosted his fundraising page, and now we've had reports about us put into the regulator. And it doesn't take much to see the disparity. One is discrimination, and the other is speech. Speech and discrimination are not exactly the same thing. The response to the speech was demented in its lack of proportionality. Total overkill. And that's why, traditionally, typically, what we've always done is fight speech with speech. Not with something more. I mean, if somebody lies, you tell the truth. If somebody's given a poor argument, you return with a good one. If someone's made an error, then you correct it. That's the appropriate response to Izzy, who did not actually discriminate. He didn't discriminate because he's never refused to play with another teammate. He's never mistreated someone in a substantive way. There's nobody with their hand up saying, well, Israel Folau did a terrible thing to me and this is what he did. That person doesn't exist. He's never denied anyone some benefit or imposed on them some harm because of who they are. There's been no substantive act. What he's done is speak, which is a slightly different thing. And we're entering dangerous territory when we start to conflate those two things. Secondly, people said to me, well, okay, but does Israel really need the money? Is that really something that's worth doing? Is it even a good idea to give money to a guy who seems to have some? Well, there's a few things here. Firstly, it's a gesture of support, tangible, real, helpful support that is not wasted. I know that Israel Folau has in fact been through a lot. I know that he's had his tough days, he's had his hard times. I know that this was very, very, very difficult to deal with when it happened. And that tangible support that people decided that they wanted to give to him was really worth something. It was worth something to them, and it was worth something to him. But also, I think it's worth noting this. Yes, he has some accumulated assets. He has to live, or he may well have to live off of those accumulated assets for a very long time. He's been banned for life from the two sports he can play at a professional level, and the sports he's been playing since he was a teenager. He has no other relevant qualifications. He has to live off of these assets for a very long time, potentially. And how much should he lose for an unjust termination like this? And he has said publicly that he can't do this. He can't raise the $3 million alone. And we don't really know his financial position after you deal with mortgages and all the rest of it. It may well be more challenging than people like to assume. But here's the other thing. People can give money to what they want. And more than $2 million was raised in less than 2 days from more than 22,000 donors. So clearly people saw something in Israel's case that they wanted to support, that they wanted to stand with. Maybe it was to help him. Maybe it was also because they thought his case was in some way their case, because they too feel the pinch of political correctness and they won't stand for it. And the other thing is, he's not going to benefit in any other way than having his legal expenses paid, because all that money that's unused on his legal expenses will be returned to the donors on a pro rata basis. He's not going to benefit from it, and we're not going to benefit from it. It's all above board. Another point that persists, which should not persist, is this. Didn't he just breach his contract? Wasn't there a clause in there that said he shouldn't say these things? Wasn't he subject to some social media conduct policy? Wasn't it an obvious breach? And therefore it's just between him and Rugby Australia. The answer is, well, no, not really. There was no such clause in his contract, and there was no such agreement the last time this was an issue about a year and a half ago. In actual fact, the clause that they claim he breached was the one that says that he brought the game into disrepute. That's a very generally phrased, broadly worded clause. And remember, he is playing in a professional sporting code, and amongst these professional sporting codes in the football arena, you have people who have been hauled up for domestic violence. You've had people who have coerced girlfriends to get abortions. You've had people who have been drunk and disorderly in public. You've had people who have been involved in all sorts of public violence and disgraceful behaviour. You've had all these things happen and more, and many of those people retain their professional playing careers. So when it comes to that threshold of bringing the game into disrepute, was he to suspect that posting a paraphrase of a Bible verse on his social media would really trigger that clause? I don't think so. He certainly didn't. And so therefore this was not a clear part of his contract. In fact, the clause that's been used against him is a clause that's worded very generally, and it's a clause that exists in most standard employment contracts. A clause like this, a clause with this kind of general application, would exist in most employment contracts, most codes that apply to professional accreditations, and most codes that apply to memberships in different institutions. So we're all subject to this kind of thing. So if Israel Folau can be fired on that basis, then his case really is our case if we have a job or an accreditation. Because we too are bound by codes of conduct with generally worded statements like that one. People also said to me from time to time, well, shouldn't you be calling for donations to sick children and other such worthy causes? You'll find many of these accusations carry a line of guilt to show you what a bad person you are. And of course, singling out sick children as the most vulnerable people group has that effect. But see, here's the thing. There's two problems here. Firstly, it's not either or. You don't either give to a sick child or to Israel Folau. That's not how most Australians operate. They give to the causes that they see, which they find compelling, which they find interesting, which they find that they think, which resonate with their desire to give and to assist. Just giving $20 to Israel Folau does not mean, therefore, you're not going to give $20 to a sick child for the next 12 months in the vast majority of cases. And if people are concerned about sick children as they ought to be, so they should give to causes that support charities in that area. And I am actually quite certain that the huge majority of those who donated to Israel Folau also give generously to charity. And so we should, and I'd encourage everyone to do it. But here's the other thing. That argument assumes implicitly that the issue to which people did give has limited value. And I want to dispute that. It doesn't have limited value because this is a question of the very freedoms that we enjoy to live our beliefs, to live our faith, to express that faith and express those beliefs and be true to the faith that we carry in word, in deed, in action and in life, and do so without fear. That's a freedom that Israel Folau might want to enjoy, but it's actually a freedom that every Australian wants to enjoy. And that is why the principle at work here has broad application for the very nature of democracy itself. It is important. But also, as Christians, there's another consideration. And the other consideration is this: what we're actually fighting for here is freedom to continue to be able to declare the truth openly, in the voice of an ordinary Australian, not necessarily with a law degree or a legal degree where we can, be silver tongues and argue well, but just simply talk about it, to spread the truth. And if we can't spread the truth, if the truth is not free, then the very reason for our existence in this world is severely compromised. The very object of our faith is compromised. Because what does Paul pray for in the paradigm of government in 1 Timothy 2? He prays that it might be such that all people everywhere can come to a knowledge of the truth. The truth might be free to be encountered through the testimony of Christian lives and through the statement of Christian beliefs and the preaching of the Christian gospel. That lies at the heart of our faith. And I think nearly every Christian will accept that. And so if we're giving to this cause, we are giving to a very important cause at all. In fact, it's this serious. If this is not so, then we cannot properly love our neighbour at all, because that has got to be at the heart of neighbour love, to tell them the truth. I'm also told, is it not inconsistent to argue freedom for religious schools and other institutions and say, well, they should be able to hire and fire religious staff, but Rugby Australia can't? To which again I say, well, no, not really, because the concept of an ethos-based organisation is very well established in law and in history and in the way we do things. These are organisations where the very purpose and objective of the organisation is so intrinsically bound up in a philosophical or religious purpose that staff must adhere to that philosophy or religion or that ethos in order for the purpose to be achieved. The obvious example is a church. What are they doing? They're converting and discipling Christians. Of course, the staff therefore have to be Christian because it's intrinsic to the very objective and ethos of that organisation. What about a political party? Same thing. They're actually promoting through policy a particular political view, whether it's liberalism, whether it's socialism, or whatever party they are. They must have staff. They can't have staff moonlighting at different political parties and doing things that are at cross purposes with the very nature of what they're trying to achieve. It's the same with a religious school. What are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to actually form Christian character in young people through the provision of education. Again, it's perfectly reasonable that they ask that their educators therefore model that Christianity as much as they're capable of giving the education, because it's intrinsic to the very purpose of that school. But what we're not arguing for is some random right for Christian companies to hire and fire at will. We're not asking that the Christian mechanic be able to fire his apprentice because he went to a synagogue. Or that the Christian tennis institute be able to fire their head coach because she quoted from the Quran. Because religion is completely irrelevant to the objective of those organisations. They have to be religiously agnostic in their staffing. They cannot contract out of discrimination principles. It's the same with Rugby Australia. Rugby Australia is not trying to promote the tenets of atheism through the playing of sport. There's nothing intrinsic to their objective, their sporting objective, that requires them to take an interest in the religion of the players. There simply isn't. In fact, they have no business doing so. So this is not a comparison with apples and apples at all. It's apples and oranges. There are ethos-based organisations, and there are the majority of organisations which are not and shouldn't be. Finally, isn't he killing people? That's one I got a few times. Isn't it so that expressing these ideas publicly actually has a negative impact on the mental health of particularly LGBT young people? Is the most common thing that was raised with me. I'm going to deal with that one in the next section because it is a singularly important argument to look at. It demands our attention because if it's true, we've got to change. And if it's not true, we need to know that as well. But in summary, I want to say this. This has been a phenomenal outpouring of support for Israel. This has been an incredible week. $2.2 million, 2 days, 22,000 donors. And I can't help but think something as I look at this. I can't help but think that God has used Israel's brave stand. And God has done that throughout history. There's biblical examples, there's examples from history. You know, very often it is someone with the conviction of, say, Martin Luther, who said at the trial that he had at what they call the Diet of Worms, where he stood there and he said, I cannot recant. My conscience is held captive by sacred scripture. Here I stand. I can do no other. And he stood firm on his convictions when he was given the opportunity to recant and backtrack and go backwards. But he didn't, and he believed that he would die. But look at the incredible impact that Martin Luther had on his times, and the incredible light that shone as a result of his efforts in both Protestant and Catholic traditions. And you know, that's common. In the Bible, you think of someone like Daniel. He just purposed in his heart that he wouldn't eat the king's food, and he did so because he wanted to serve God. There was no sin in eating the king's food as far as I can tell, but he was concerned about it. And God saw that, and as I often say to youth groups, that was the first day of the rest of his life at 15. And God honoured it, and great change came through him. It's a biblical quality called being pure in heart. Living your life, as it were, before an audience of just one person who is God. And living it out of conviction to him, love for him and service for him in all circumstances. As if you're seeing God, you know the Beatitude, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And I believe Israel had that moment. And as imperfect as his expression might be, And as much as all of us could sit back and say, oh, why did you do that, or could you do it better, and so on, it's not the point. I believe that he did want to serve God in his motive, in his heart, and I do believe that God has used his testimony for good so far.